Andrew Carnegie was once the richest man in the world. Carnegie made steel, steel made America, and Carnegie accumulated millions. Then, having succeeded in making more money than anyone else on earth, Carnegie determined to become the world's greatest benefactor by giving all of his money away.
The man who dies rich dies disgraced.
Andrew Carnegie, in a way, had exactly the same philosophy as the famous Plunkett of Tammany Hall, the machine politician, who said of himself, he's seen his opportunities and he took them.
I think of all of the so-called builders of modern America, he may be the most complex and therefore the most interesting.
The figures who build, who leave, if you like, industrial monuments, monuments which are built over the bones of workers and over the destroyed fortunes of innumerable competitors, but still monuments, people like John D. Rockefeller of Standard Oil, people such as J. Pierpont Morgan in finance. These are the people who leave a lasting legacy, and Carnegie is one of them.
The amassing of wealth is one of the worst species of idolatry.
Carnegie amassed his vast fortune in a questionable though gilded age, rejoicing in his favorite quotation from Robert Burns.
Thine own reproach alone do fear.
Not many of the men who helped build modern America had much time for self-reproach. Ruthless, selfish, arrogant, they saw themselves as entrepreneurial statesmen whose empires made the Republic great. Others saw them as robber barons, heedless of waste in pursuit of wealth.
What was Carnegie ultimately? Was he simply a robber baron? Was he an industrial statesman? Was he a great philanthropist? Was he a great idealist? He's all of that.
People think of Carnegie as being somebody who tried to justify the Gilded Age, to justify big business, to justify being a robber baron. But in actual fact, what Carnegie is really doing is talking to himself.
He makes a very revealing statement when he argues for the gospel of wealth. When he's arguing to men of great wealth to give away all their wealth back to the society from whence it came, he said, lists all the advantages of doing that. And then he says, and besides, it provides a refuge from self-questioning. And that's precisely what Carnegie was after, a refuge from self-questioning.
Andrew Carnegie was born in Dunfermline in 1835. Dunfermline was once the ancient capital of Scotland, the burial ground of kings and queens. The son of a handloom weaver, his birthplace is now a museum run by the Carnegie Dunfermline Trust.
His father was a skilled artisan, handcraft weaver. Mostly it was a life of poverty. And once, of course, the technology of machine woven goods came in, then the hand-loomed weaver was out.
It was burnt into my heart then that my father, though neither abject, mean, nor vile, as Burns had it, had nevertheless to beg a brother of the earth to give him leave to toil. And then and there came the resolve that I would cure that when I got to be a man.
The glittering prizes, the gifts and trappings of wealth measure the success of that resolve. He was honored by 57 towns and cities in Britain alone, a record never bettered. But critics saw him as a publicity seeker who never gave a cent that wasn't returned tenfold in public adulation.
The father was a hard-working, decent man who never made it in the United States and died sadly, a failure by the standards of his new country, though not, I think, a failure by his own standards. His mother, on the other hand, was a very tough, ruthless woman, a woman realizing that it was a man's world and a cruel world, and to beat that world with its own weapons.
It was his mother, Margaret, who insisted the family move to America. She was already becoming the dominant influence on Carnegie's life. Years later, he echoed Napoleon.
The destiny of the son is the work of the mother.
In a feminist, conscious world of today, we lose sight of the women who made it behind the scenes and who forced their men to go to the strict and narrow much more ruthlessly than the men might have done themselves.
He always felt his mother loved the younger brother more. He made a vow at a very young age he would never marry as long as his mother lived, and he kept to that vow. I would take a psychiatrist, I think, to explore that relationship. She was a very tough and very demanding person.
When Margaret Carnegie died in 1886, Andrew was 50. A year later, he married Louise Whitfield, the daughter of a New York businessman.
Mrs. Carnegie, his wife, at a later date would say, my mother-in-law was the most unpleasant woman I ever met.
It was in May 1848, with money borrowed from relatives, the Carnegies sailed from Glasgow on board the Wiscasset, bound for New York.
The immigrant is the capable, energetic, ambitious, discontented man.
We have to remember that born in 1835, emigrating in 1848, he emigrated as a boy who had seen his parents' fortunes decline into economic failure. He had also seen the family heritage of radicalism, hostility to the landed gentry, hatred of aristocracy, belief in Chartism, among other things. He goes to America. He finds the new country which gives him a chance of getting ahead.
New York was the gateway to the vast, empty continent for millions of immigrant families arriving from Europe in the middle of the 19th century. When the Carnegies saw it for the first time, the tallest structure of the New York skyline was the spire of Trinity Church. 50 years later, it was dwarfed by buildings constructed with Carnegie's steel. Exhausted and penniless, the Carnegie family arrived in Pittsburgh, where relatives were already settled, only to find a city which was little better than a cholera-ridden swamp. A smoke-begrimed settlement built on a peninsula where the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers meet and form the Ohio. Having traveled in hope, reality was a two-room slum in Slabtown. Looming, bustling America proved a heady mixture.
He's found in America what Scotland would be if it weren't for artificial constraints of privilege, landlordism, monarchy, and so on. In fact, he finds America very much at a turning point.
The old nations of the earth creep on at a snail's pace. The Republic thunders past with the rush of an express.
It destroys his father, but it gives him more and more opportunity. And he sees in the vindication of America a vindication of himself.
His first job was in a cotton mill at $1.20 a week. He loathed the work. But in 1849 was offered the job that set him on the path to riches.
He got his first real break by becoming a telegraph boy, and that gave him insights into the whole business community of Pittsburgh, and in turn would lead to his first employment with the railroads. And he was one of the very first, some people claim he was the first, who could simply take down a telegraph message by hearing the clicks of the receiver. He got so good that when finally the railroads came to Pittsburgh and Thomas Scott came as Western Division Director for the Pennsylvania Railroad, he hired Carnegie as his personal secretary and telegrapher.
Thomas Scott brought the railroad to Pittsburgh, and it was on Scott's advice that Carnegie made his first investment. When his first dividend check arrived, Carnegie waved it in the air, shouting,
Eureka! Here's the goose that lays the golden egg.
An investment in sleeping cars also paid off. because Scott ran them on his railroads. And it was Scott who gave his white-haired Scotch devil his first taste of Washington politics when he called Carnegie to the capital to keep the telegraph system working at the outbreak of the Civil War. Carnegie liked to boast he was the first casualty in the defense of Washington after he was accidentally slashed across the face by a wire.
When my country calls for assistance of any kind, I consider it my glorious duty to answer that call. And if the President should command me to do anything for my country, I should regard it the same as I would the voice of God.
Carnegie ultimately came to almost idolize Lincoln. And yet, Carnegie's own record in the Civil War is a bit spotty. Carnegie was drafted, but he paid an Irishman $800 to go in his place. Could be done in the Civil War. So his patriotism had certain limitations.
Carnegie returned to Pittsburgh. There were profits to be made in the war industries, and 90 miles to the north, oil had been discovered. Carnegie was on his way to his first million. Aged 26, it was time to return to Dunfermline.
Once when he was a small child, Carnegie said, "Don't worry, Mother, I'm going to make money, and you'll someday ride in a coach." And she said, "What good would it do if the people in Dunfermline couldn't see me?"
Although he left Dunfermline when he was only 12, he had tremendous love for the place. And he always wanted to do something for the inhabitants, the toiling masses, as he called them.
Years later, his vast fortune established, Carnegie ensured that his memory would survive in the town and country of his birth. Dunfermline, his old grey tomb, was well endowed. The first of many gifts built the public baths. His mother laid the cornerstone. The Carnegie Library, opened in 1881, was the first of more than 3,000 libraries gifted worldwide. And there was a Carnegie Hall in Dunfermline before New York. But despite his vast wealth and the gifts which he showered upon the town, there was one place in Dunfermline where the gates remained firmly closed to Carnegie: Pittencrieff Park.
As a child, he was never allowed to go into Pittencrieff, which was a magnificent private park which contained some of the most historic ruins of Scotland. Carnegie used to stand outside the gates and look in at this lovely park. The owner, a man named James Hunt, had forbidden any Morrison or any Morrison descendant to ever set foot in Pittencrieff. When he made his great fortune, he was able to buy Pittencrieff, and he said of all of his possessions, this gave him the greatest pride. He then opened it to all the public, all the time, forever.
Blood is thicker than water everywhere, but in no part of the world is it so very much thicker than beyond the River Tweed.
In America, 1 million men returned to work at the end of the Civil War. They poured into the oil fields, they built the railways, and went in search of free land in the West.
He rides high with the tremendous roaring momentum given to capitalism by the Civil War itself. He sees the new technology emerging, and with his tremendous quickness, he brings together a whole variety of new techniques in finance and in technology. He uses them to get himself forward, but at the same time, he needs to justify himself, and does so by justifying that America.
The cities were opening up, the ports booming. The ambitious, the risk-takers, and the gamblers were making and losing fortunes. At this time, the Republic was producing its own breed of aristocracy, the robber barons, John D. Rockefeller, the man they called the Jupiter of Wall Street, J.P. Morgan, and Andrew Carnegie, King Steel.
He quickly recognized that steel was going to dominate the world, particularly through railroads, and the potential was tremendous. The building of the Transcontinental Railroad showed that the whole of America could be tied together by a steel network. Carnegie once said of all the things he ever built, the thing that gave him the most satisfaction was the building of a bridge, which is spoken like a good Scotsman. There's a kind of mystic feeling, as in many of Burns' poems, about the brig. And Carnegie saw it as a kind of symbol of America after the Civil War, of building bridges that would tie the country together again.
The Eads Bridge, which crosses the mighty Mississippi at St. Louis, was the way west. Carnegie made a profit on every stage of its construction. Other bridges followed. He didn't finance them all, but like the Brooklyn Bridge, which links the island of Manhattan with Brooklyn, Carnegie steel went into their construction. And just as surely as it was steel from his Pittsburgh mills that went into rails and bridges, so it went into building the new America, upwards. The American steel industry, in effect Carnegie's, became the wonder of the world through long hours, low wages, and bleak conditions. When Carnegie showed the visiting English philosopher Herbert Spencer his foundries, the heat and noise reduced Spencer to a state of collapse. He said 6 months' residence here would justify suicide. Even Carnegie was forced to admit
It was like hell with the lid off.
Carnegie built his steel empire by remaining a maverick, by taking on what he called the fathers of Israel. Steelmaking in America was a cozy little group of men in eastern Pennsylvania or in the Pittsburgh area. He challenged them all. He was willing to take great chances. And above all, he never put profit as the main goal. He was always to reduce cost. The other so-called captains of industry didn't ever quite know how to deal with him. They never really trusted him. The efforts to build pools and business trusts, which Carnegie would engage in, but only as long as it benefited him. He would then pull out and leave the whole edifice to collapse.
Carnegie accumulated his vast fortune in the time it took America to move from the log cabin to the skyscraper. His Pittsburgh steel empire was self-financing and never mortgaged to Wall Street.
He held his men to the company, not by paying salaries, very, very small salaries, but he held them by giving them 1/18 of 1% in the partnership. They didn't dare leave because they knew if they left, they lost their share.
Carnegie dominated his partners with one exception, Henry Clay Frick.
When Frick was asked, apparently on behalf of Carnegie in old age, if he, Frick, would go and see Carnegie once more, Frick replied, "Tell him I'll meet him in hell." Just after the marriage of Henry Clay Frick, when Carnegie was literally courting him even more than Frick was courting his own wife, Carnegie throws this great dinner in New York in the summer of 1881, and with more and more Baroque compliments flying, ends up by proposing and thus inaugurating the partnership of Carnegie and Frick. And at that point, Margaret Carnegie says, "Ach, Andra, that's very nice for Mr. Frick, but what's in it for us?"
Years later, it was Frick who engineered the strike which haunts Carnegie's name to this day, Homestead.
The most famous sentence associated with Carnegie, the most famous one-liner, is actually something which much more harks back to his father's and his maternal uncle's radicalism in Britain than to his own situation as an employer. And that's the phrase, "Thou shalt not take thy neighbor's job," became a great slogan for labor in Carnegie's time.
A few miles up the Monongahela River from Pittsburgh, Homestead is still a steel town. Here, in the summer of 1892, negotiations between the Carnegie Company and the workers collapsed. Carnegie was in Scotland when the strike began.
Carnegie had been finding himself growing more and more unhappy with dealing with trade unions. In 1892, Carnegie really had been hoping for a situation where unions would have been destroyed in Homestead. He was hoping that impossible terms would, in a sense, be put to the unions, terms which would appear attractive to the workers, that's to say, where the workers would be dealt in on an apparently profit-sharing basis with a sliding wage scale, and that this would lead people out of the unions altogether. Now, his partner, Henry Clay Frick, offered something entirely different, which was a straightforward confrontation.
Carnegie was against using strikebreakers. In the event of a strike, he had instructed Frick to sit it out.
To expect that one dependent upon his daily wage for the necessaries of life will stand peaceably by and see a new man employed in his stead is to expect too much.
Because Homestead was so compact, because it was so easily focused upon, it's become the kind of epitome of labor management relationship.
Carnegie is in Scotland on vacation in 1892. Frick sets up a confrontation when Carnegie is not there. The confrontation is using the detectives of the Allen Pinkerton organization, founded also by a Scotsman who also came of Chartist and radical antecedents. Frick uses the Pinkerton men. The Pinkerton men bring in strikebreakers. There is this tremendous defense by the workers themselves on the Homestead plant. And what you actually have here is a question of all the strikebreakers under Pinkerton's guidance going in, the poor, refuse, unemployables of labor who are now getting the last job they could obtain on the hopeless wages of $1 a day to be strikebreakers. And in the course of the battling, it is they who are most savagely beaten up. It is an irony that in the confrontation between labor and capital, it is other laboring men rather than the capitalists who get hurt.
Public support for the workers at Homestead collapsed after Alexander Berkman, an anarchist, burst into Frick's office and shot him. The wounded Frick cabled Carnegie in Scotland. "Shot twice, not dangerously, no necessity for you to return."
The Homestead strike has everything in it. It has violence, it has Pinkertons, it has the attempt to break a strike, it has all the high drama of labor management relations. I think that's why it's persisted. And it persisted in Carnegie's heart, too. He never got over the scars of Homestead.
Carnegie really liked the idea of an employer having a personal relation with his fellow men. A characteristic example is during a labor dispute. The men, it is arranged, representatives of them will come up and see Carnegie. There's discussion taking place in the room. One man, nervously having difficulty in summoning up the courage to speak to the great employer, says, "Well, take my job, Mr. Carnegie." And Carnegie, seeing the great moment, pauses, smiles. "But I won't take away anyone's job."
Carnegie and his henchmen were never again threatened by trade union power. Wages were cut as profits soared.
Keep in mind, in Carnegie in these years was running a radical campaign through the newspapers he owned in Britain to overthrow the monarchy, to disestablish the church, to give Britain essentially the American Constitution. And after Homestead, he was accused particularly of hypocrisy.
There's one very hard word to be said about him, and it's this. As his philanthropy went on in the years after Homestead, he gave away money, he gave away libraries. The working wage in Homestead remained poorer and poorer in relation to the working force outside. In the worst depression the United States had ever seen in the 1890s, the condition of Carnegie's workers there were among the worst around. The sliding scale, the profit sharing of which he had boasted, got more and more wretched and finally ceased altogether. And yet at the same time, Carnegie went on congratulating himself for the philanthropy with which he gave away the money which he had obtained under such conditions.
Don't be fastidious. Take what the gods have to offer.
Carnegie Steel Works were fed from the Conneaut iron ore terminal built on the shore of Lake Erie. The terminal was supplied with ore brought from the Mesabi mountain range, 1,000 miles away in Minnesota. Cheap and easily mined, the Mesabi ore was owned by oilman John D. Rockefeller.
Both of them were ambitious, able, aggressive people, and it's natural that two such people, if they're in related fields, would feel a certain sense of competition, just as two people who were in a sailboat race feel competitive. But I certainly was never conscious of any animus or hostility or unfriendly competition between the two of them.
Carnegie needed that Mesabi ore. Rockefeller knew its worth. The two men made a deal which gave Carnegie exclusive access to the precious ore. He was now well and truly King Steel. In 1899, the Carnegie Steel Company, whose assets totaled $25 million, recorded profits of $21 million. Carnegie had become the world's largest manufacturer of steel. His position was impregnable. Characteristically, now that he was the biggest, Carnegie decided it was time to expand. His mood caused panic on Wall Street. There was only one man in the world who could stop Carnegie now: the powerful and respected Wall Street financier, J.P. Morgan.
Pierpont Morgan really was the orthodox financial statesman. And he saw Carnegie as an extremely dangerous maverick who simply could not be trusted and who was likely, above all, to send the market plunging up and down with its utmost utterance. Because the rule in American finance capitalism is this, and has been from the first: you must inspire confidence in the market. The great phrase used about Alexander Hamilton: he touched the corpse of public credit and it sprang to life at his feet. And that business of confidence in the market was something which was impaired by a figure like Carnegie.
As go-between, Morgan chose Charlie Schwab, who had risen from the foundry floor to the board of Carnegie Steel, and who was to become famous years later as the man who broke the bank at Monte Carlo. Carnegie, age 65, had his price. It was $500 million, written in pencil on a scrap of paper. Morgan's acceptance was immediate. The biggest sale in American industrial history had been consummated with all the formality of an errand boy taking a shopping list to the corner grocery store. From his sickbed, Carnegie's longtime partner, Henry Phipps, welcomed the news with unrestrained glee. Ain't Andy wonderful? Some people thought otherwise. Not that Carnegie cared. His share was worth $300 million. J.P. Morgan, calling on him at his Fifth Avenue mansion, remarked, "Mr. Carnegie, I want to congratulate you on being the richest man in the world." For Morgan and his cohorts, the deal marked the beginnings of the conglomerate which became U.S. Steel, the world's first billion-dollar corporation. For Carnegie, it was the start of a new career. Before, he had worked hard at making money, lots of money. Now he shifted his interests to finding the means to give it all away.
The man who dies, leaving behind him millions of available wealth, will pass away unwept, unhonored, and unsung.
He was determined that a rich man should not die rich, in his own words, and set about in a way that exceeded any industrialist of his time.
I think in a way, his family were lucky that he left them anything. And he did not leave them enormously wealthy. He left them just comfortably off because he really felt an obligation, the gospel of wealth, as he called it, to return to society at large the great fortune that he had made.
He found it infinitely harder to give away his money than to get it, and to his own surprise, he got far more criticism for the giving than he ever got for the getting.
Mr. Carnegie gives away his wealth as quietly as a waiter falling downstairs with a tray full of glasses.
My grandfather and Mr. Carnegie were the subject of very sharp and to my way of thinking, very unfair criticism. I suppose this is not surprising in that they did make a great deal of money, and others who were less fortunate could understandably be envious of what they had. On the other hand, I think that neither of them allowed that criticism to interfere with their using those funds as wisely and well as they were able to.
It got so much publicity that some of the newspapers began to run box scores, like baseball games. Carnegie's given this much this week, Rockefeller's given this much. Carnegie was always comfortably ahead until the end of his life.
The gospel of wealth but echoes Christ's words. It calls upon the millionaire to sell all he has and to give it, in the highest form, to the poor.
Carnegie despised charity. He made it a dirty word. He said it was condescending, and it usually accomplished nothing. He said, "I'd as soon throw the money into the ocean as to give charity." But philanthropy was something different. Philanthropy, which means simply love of mankind, is to elevate, not to simply sustain, but to elevate the human race.
Upon no foundation but that of popular education can man erect the structure of an enduring civilization.
It's because of the fact that Carnegie is acquiring so much and is, as I believe, at war with himself so much, that makes him do so many things of such an extraordinary kind, including the great endowment for international peace, the endowment for the universities of education, the endowment for education in Scotland, the tremendous anxiety to make everything possible so that the world will produce more Carnegies.
Black glass and steel reflects the face of modern Pittsburgh. It was in Pittsburgh, where he assembled his vast fortune, that Carnegie began the process of giving most of it away. What is now the Carnegie Mellon University, with its Skibo Hall and tartan football team, started as the Carnegie Technical School and was housed in a single building. The Margaret Morrison Carnegie Hall was dedicated to his mother, who had cobbled shoes to feed her family. Pittsburgh was to set the pattern for his philanthropy.
Well, Andrew Carnegie, as you know, gave about 3,300 libraries throughout the United States, Canada, and the English-speaking world.
His boast was that the sun never set on a Carnegie Free Library. You can find them in Australia, New Zealand, you'll find them in America, in Pittsburgh, here in Dornoch, Wick, Edinburgh. They're all over the place.
Basically, he gave the money to build the buildings and to furnish them with books and furniture, but then left it up to the community to support them through public funds.
The oldest Carnegie Library in America can be found in Braddock, Pennsylvania, part of the once prosperous industrial belt around Pittsburgh, now known as the Rust Belt.
I think it's a real tragedy that the library, together with swimming pool and basketball courts and pool rooms and reading rooms, is closed in Braddock. It's really too bad. The whole community, it's a tragedy. But really, the population has dropped so that there's no need for such a big place like that. It would be nice. There are lots of things that would be nice.
It was built in 1889 by Andrew Carnegie for the men of his Carnegie Steel Works. The library was completed in 1889, and then in 1893, Carnegie added what we call the clubhouse. We want to, again, renovate the building, but we're doing it room by room, and immediately for Carnegie's birthday, we want to clean the outside of the building and have community groups and others in Pittsburgh do benefits for us, and that money will be used to restore the outside of the building. I think Andrew Carnegie would be proud of what this group is trying to do.
In nearby Pittsburgh, a library that once held many books will now hold only one. But the Carnegie Institute has prospered.
Since the 1890s, the administration and the directors have been very aware of the changing needs of a community. And certainly the museums have kept up with new and changing exhibits, expanding collections, and various programs that reach out into the communities.
Carnegie, the Pittsburgher, wrote of the Institute,
"It was built by a Pittsburgher with Pittsburgher money for Pittsburgh."
By the time he started ridding himself of his money, Carnegie had long since deserted Pittsburgh, where the money was made, for New York, which was then the gilded capital of a gilded age. It was in New York, while riding in Central Park, that he met Louise Whitfield. Their home on Fifth Avenue was a palace built with steel. The house contains 64 rooms and Manhattan's first private lift.
Oh, they were wonderful days, extraordinary life. It's just unbelievable. Oh, he adored Mother. He had rather a nice voice, rather an educated voice, as I remember. Oh, he was a wonderful man. I'm not belittling him.
After his one and only child was born, Margaret, when he was 62 years old, his wife insisted that they have their own castle in Scotland.
I was always a Scot. Well, I am half Scottish. And in feeling, I think whole Scottish.
He began a grand search, and he found a very historic but very dilapidated castle in Dornoch, and he poured millions into it and turned it into the culmination, essentially, of his life.
Life in Carnegie's Highland heaven, though remote, was never dull. He delighted in mixing guests with a complete disregard for their social background. One disappointment was the library. Carnegie was angry that the books had been rebound. Only one book was well read, The Age of Reason by Tom Paine.
He was tremendously enthusiastic about harder and harder death duties. He constantly said, in relation to both Britain and America, that the notion of inheritance itself was bringing a totally unjustifiable dead hand of privilege to Aeon later generations. He wanted to have a radical system of land reform which would end the old, hard hold of the landowning aristocracy on British politics and society. He not only wanted home rule for Ireland, he wanted clearly home rule for Scotland, home rule for Wales. He wanted a kind of system very much like the federal system of his glorified America.
Carnegie, everything he did, he wanted to be good at. He wanted to win. And in fact, they used to say that if you beat him at golf, you didn't get invited back to Skivo.
Writing of a successful week's golf, Carnegie added a postscript.
I was given a stroke a hole, but that is a mere detail.
At her home in Connecticut, Margaret remembers childhood days in the Scottish Highlands when she was told bedtime stories by Rudyard Kipling and wakened to the sound of bagpipes.
A piper, oh, my word, Skivo, Angus MacPherson. 100 trippers and all, 100 trippers and all, we'll up and get it all, blow, 100 trippers. Oh, it's a wonderful country.
I got a phone call to go out to Skibo. And I remember sitting there in the great entry hall of Skibo, and the peat fire was burning. And she said to me, Mr. Simpson, she said, I see you're having problems with your organ. And then, to my amazement, she said, will you just hand me over my handbag? Now she said, will you just write yourself a check for what you need? Well, I've never written as big a check in all my life. And then, with a twinkle in her eye, she said to me, now, Mr. Simpson, she said, I'm giving you this on one condition. And I said, and what's that, Margaret? She said, I'm giving you it on condition that you'll promise to get me out of the poorhouse if ever I finish up in the poorhouse.
In 1980, a combination of failing health and taxation forced Margaret to sell the estate with all of its happy memories and its fairy glen. In Andrew Carnegie's time, the estate had employed more than 100 people from the surrounding communities.
He paid £1 a week for the similar or comparable work. The wages were about, some places 10 shillings, some places 15 shillings. But round about the 15 shillings when he paid £1 a week. If you desired, you could leave part of your wages, or the whole of them if you could, and he gave you 6% on your investment. And also the 10% for signing the pledge. A 10% on your year's wages, 10% bonus.
It is with God's mercy I was born a Scotsman, for I don't see how I could be content to be anything else.
He loved what the church at its finest stood for, but he couldn't stand smug dogmatists. That he detested. In fact, he was put off the church once during a transatlantic voyage. He attended church on board the ship, And as he said, he had hoped that day that the minister would speak of the vast unknown, of the mighty God, surrounded, as they were by the mighty ocean. But he said, unfortunately, the minister spent the whole time of his sermon trying to prove that the wine at the wedding of the Cana of Galilee was non-alcoholic. And as Carnegie said, I will never forgive him.
3 windows in the cathedral at Dornach commemorate Carnegie's innumerable benefactions. One is dedicated to music. Carnegie gifted over 8,000 organs. Another illustrates books and learning. The third is abiding passion, world peace.
War is the foulest fiend vomited forth from the mouth of hell.
Carnegie wanted to see an end to war. He believed peace could be maintained through arbitration. Moral and legal sanctions were enough. President after president was bombarded with his views. He built a peace palace at The Hague, where the World Court now sits. And he provided a home for the Organization of American States in Washington. In 1910, when he founded the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace with a gift of $10 million, its first offices were in Blair House, just a short distance from the White House.
And he had a worldview. He was a pacifist, He also was quite an optimist. You may have heard that when he set up the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, he specified that whenever international peace would have been securely established, the funds could be used for other purposes.
It turns out to have been a hard-boiled political bargain in 1910 with the then Taft administration in the White House, and it involved a commitment on the part of the administration to pursue the arbitration treaty with Great Britain, and on Carnegie's part, in effect, the funding and lobbying for this operation. I suppose some people might say, looking at these facts, that Carnegie was trying to buy the cabinet, or at least the president.
Andrew Carnegie died at Lenox, Massachusetts on August the 11th, 1919. He was 83. Buried at Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Tarrytown, New York, his grave is marked by a Celtic cross cut from stone quarried near Skibo. Louise, who died 27 years later, lies beside him. In life, Carnegie battled and smashed the labor unions. Ironically, in death, he lies close to the workers' hero, the man who built the American Federation of Labor, Samuel Gompers. Carnegie's name survives in a variety of ways. This delicatessen boasts the best pastrami sandwiches in New York. Less contentiously, perhaps, nearby Carnegie Hall, opened in 1891, still attracts the world's biggest names. This was a straight $2 million investment, and Carnegie never made a dollar profit on it. Manhattan is also the home of his largest philanthropy, the Carnegie Corporation of New York, which he started with an endowment of $125 million.
With the money wisely invested over the years, much more has been spent on grants than he originally gave. Today, the value is about $540 million, and we spend about $30 million a year on grants. The notion that education goes everywhere, belongs in every nook and cranny of the society, that was his concept, and I think it lives today.
His virtues were the virtues of the early 19th and even late 18th century, from which his mother and father and grandparents had sprung. There is a tremendous yearning for applause constantly. There is a constant attempt to be apologizing to the ghosts of his radical ancestors.
The commitment to education, to peace, to social justice, to a worldview, those are fundamental, enduring themes of great value. They are manifested in different ways at different times, obviously, as circumstances change, but there's no doubt in my mind that he picked enduring themes of great human significance, and we make variations on those themes today.
Carnegie always remained a Scotsman. He was also an American. He liked to say he was a star-spangled Scotsman.